Jen, I'll probably ask you just to do a brief description for yourself or introduction about who you are and the work you do.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to do that.
Awesome. Oh, we're live. I think we're live. Great. Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Our Path Forward with CAIR Washington. And today we're talking about the growing threat of tech surveillance at home and abroad. And we're joined by Jennifer Lee from the ACLU. She is I want to get your title right here. Maybe you could just introduce yourself. That'd be great.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Lee, and I'm the Tech and Liberty Manager here at the ACLU Washington. I lead our tech policy work. For those of you who may not know, the ACLU is a public interest law firm, and we work to protect people's civil liberties in many different areas, including immigration, healthcare, youth policy, policing, and much more. But in the tech and liberty space, we work on protecting people's civil rights and civil liberties in the face of increasingly powerful technology. A key part of our work is convening a tech equity coalition that CAIR Washington also participates in. It's otherwise known as the TEC, and we seek to uplift the voices of marginalized communities in decision-making about tech policy. We work closely with the Tech Equity Coalition to advance strong tech policies that are accountable to people, and particularly people who are disproportionately affected by tech abuses. I'm glad to be here with everyone today, and I'm really excited for a conversation about surveillance.
Thank you so much, Jen. We're really happy to have you. We're also joined today by our attorney, Brianna Auffray, and our community outreach fellow, Aydin Anwar. Brianna is going to be talking with Jen about tech surveillance and kind of the battle that's going on here in Washington State to protect people's privacy and their civil rights. And Aydin is going to talk about what is happening in other countries in terms of Islamophobia and how technology is being used to oppress and in some cases commit genocide against people like the Uyghurs in East Turkestan, and kind of connecting the dots for us between, mass surveillance technology here at home and also how it's being used abroad. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Before we get started with the conversation, I'd like to just briefly tell people what this show is about. I think this is our 11th episode, and Our Path Forward is a weekly live stream by CAIR Washington. We started this, or we came up with this idea after the attacks on the Capitol happened, and Trump lost the election and the COVID vaccine was rolling out. There's like all these like huge moments that felt like happening at the same time. And also things were changing in terms of, we were having Trump out of office and then here comes Biden. And we really want to talk about like, what does our path forward look like as a community, as an organization, and as a country now that Trump is out of office, but so much of the issues are still there. These systemic issues like white supremacy, immigration, these larger issues. So we thought we'd have weekly live streams with our team so that we could talk about the work that we do at CAIR Washington, give people a chance to kind of learn more about the work that we do. I think a lot of times people see the kind of the big things that you do, but they don't get a behind the scenes look about the day-to-day. So we've been wanting to talk about tech surveillance for quite a while. It's a big part of the work that we do, that our policy and legal team does. And I'm very excited. I know quite a bit about it, but I want to hear more. I want to hear about the facial recognition ban and the Tech Equity Coalition. So very excited. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. I think my first question is actually for Miss Brianna. Brianna, I know when we were talking about this episode, you talked about the importance of kind of defining some of these terms and what we mean by surveillance technology. Could you kind of just give us a brief description about what is surveillance technology and what are some examples of surveillance technology?
It's kind of a nebulous concept, I guess, because it isn't something that we can point to a bolded list and go, this is everything that's surveillance technology. But the general idea is that you are producing so much data, and there is data that's inherent to you, whether that's, biometric features or things like that.
And biometric, let's define that too, because I didn't know until I Googled. We gotta talk.
Thank you. That would be, and Jen, please jump in if I am not saying this quite well, but it's features of your person. So it could be, your face, your fingerprints, your iris scans. It's identifying you by your features. Is that a pretty good way of characterizing that, Jen?
Yeah, totally.
Jen's definitely more of the expert here than I am. In fact, when I switched to becoming the policy manager last summer, I didn't know a thing about any of this really. And Jen and other members of the Tech Equity Coalition were sort of the ones who got me up to speed on these issues. So generally what we're looking at is people are producing just massive amounts of data, especially, now that we're all on our phones all the time, we're on our computers, even more so now that, most people are working remotely. We just produce massive amounts of data. And one of the largest things that we're looking at when we're talking about tech surveillance is the mining of that data, the collection, the sale of that data, and the manipulation of that data for other things. And that's when we start, talking about things like facial recognition or automated decision systems and how that data is then being used. That's sort of the way that I tend to think of it, but it's really broad. It covers a lot of things. Jen, do you want to jump in on there?
I think you described it so well, and I agree with you. And to put it simply, I think a surveillance technology is any tool that is used to identify people and monitor public and private spaces. So that casts a really broad net. But at its core, I think what we have to understand is that surveillance is about power. Who has the power to watch and police whom, with what tools, and for what purpose? So when we think about surveillance technologies today, like Brianna was saying, we are thinking often about very advanced surveillance tools that mine or utilize massive amounts of data, like facial recognition technology or infrared devices, automated license plate readers, or traffic cameras. But I think it's also important to recognize that surveillance technologies, however advanced or rudimentary, have always been used as a tool to oppress those with less power. So one example I like to share is that in the 1700s, New York City passed a lantern law that required only Black, mixed, and Indigenous people to illuminate themselves by carrying a lit candle at night. And that was the surveillance technology of the time. These laws incentivized and made it possible for white people to enforce slave systems and incarceration via surveillance. And that was by deputizing any white person to stop those who walked without the lit candle after dark. This is the 18th century legal framework for stop and frisk policing practices that were established long before our contemporary era. And even though candles are not an advanced technology, they don't use data, they were clearly weaponized by people in power as a surveillance tool to strip Black people of privacy and fuel the slave patrols and the policing of Black bodies and lives that continues to this day. So I think, when we're thinking about or contemplating far more advanced technologies that incorporate artificial intelligence and are powered by large amounts of data, we have to consider how much more invasive these surveillance abilities and the power differential has become.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jen, for that. That's a really fascinating example from our history. You're cutting out a little bit. I think you're there now.
Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Looks like we're having a little bit of connection issues.
Yes, I think that
can everyone else?
Your end.
That's okay. Oh, we heard most of it. I think you're. Yeah. If it continues, I hate to ask this, but I might ask you to turn off your video if it continues.
Jess, I think it's on your end.
Oh, is it? Are you good? You guys are fine?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Then it's on my end. Okay, cool.
What a relief.
Yes. It's so interesting. And I think that story, that example that you told about, candles being used to monitor Black and Indigenous people hundreds of years ago as a means of white people being able to surveil and track people of color, that kind of underlines what you're saying about surveillance technology. It's like, it's not so much the specifics of the technology, it's like, what is it designed to do, or what is it being used to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of, yeah. That also is a really good segue into the next question, which is for both you, Jen, and Brianna. There's all kinds of issues regarding civil liberties and privacy when it comes to surveillance technology. And I was wondering if both of you could just talk about some real world examples, either here in Washington State or in the 50 states, about how technology has been used to surveil people in a way that is dangerous or intrusive.
Do you want to start, Jen, or do you want me?
I can share a couple examples, and maybe Brianna, you can talk about some examples specific to how the Muslim community has been surveilled. But when we're talking about the history of surveillance with the Tech Equity Coalition to lawmakers, to the general public, we emphasize stories like, for example, the passage of lantern laws in the 1700s, but also we know that in the 1930s and 40s, the US government subcontracted with IBM, which produced a machine called a Hollerith punch card machine that was used to surveil and target Japanese Americans via census data. So with this tool, Japanese Americans were surveilled and put on custodial detention lists for nearly a decade prior to being unconstitutionally incarcerated during World War II. And the Census Bureau information was compiled to determine where Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast in order to remove them from their homes and imprison them. Internal government documents uncovered by researchers revealed that that the Census Bureau actually gave the Secret Service a list of names, addresses, citizenship status, and other personal information of people of Japanese ancestry living in the DC area, the Washington, DC area. And I think this is, when we're thinking about why people are afraid, for example, to take the census today, I mean, it has a long history there's a long history there of people's data being abused, right? And, at that time, just that census data was used to unconstitutionally incarcerate an entire community of people. But as Brianna was saying, now the government agencies hold more data than could ever be imagined. And that information not only has potential to harm, but it is actually being used to surveil people every single day.
Jen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to ask you about, because the census is, we're done with it now for 2020, but it is a big issue and something we did a lot of advocacy around. And we know that history in those spheres. Wasn't there protections or laws put in place so that what happened with the census couldn't happen again? Like they just keep the data in-house and they use it for specific things.
Yeah, and I think Brianna might be able to speak more on this, but I believe so. But, and I think that's why it's really important to ensure that there are really strong data privacy protections so that people's data aren't abused, right? Because data can be very important and useful to provide benefits, provide services, compile important data and to ensure that discrimination isn't occurring. But in order to do that, while respecting people's rights and making people feel comfortable that their privacy is being protected, we need strong regulations.
Absolutely, Jen. And, it's the only reason that those protections existed this time around was because of the advocacy of impacted groups from previous times that this has happened, very, very much in large part. And so, this time around, we did see guarantees written into regulations that, information about citizenship status or, whether you're cohabitating with people who are out of status, that information is not being reported to ICE, or, that this information was only going to be used for explicitly what it was collected for. But again, you know, the only reason that we could guarantee that this time around was because people fought for those specific regulations. So it definitely was less of an issue, and we hope it is less of an issue. But at the same time, you know, that previous fear definitely informs people's decisions about how they go forward. And I think that's a huge theme that we'll see throughout a lot of what we talk about today is, you know, whether or not there are protections built in now doesn't necessarily mean that the harm isn't already done because of past abuses. If people are going to change the way that they are interacting because of past abuses, then, you know, maybe regulation can't fix everything.
Brianna, can you talk about some examples? I know that there are so many that come to your mind about how surveillance technology has been used to infringe on people's privacy or civil liberties.
Absolutely. Jen touched earlier, she mentioned automated license plate readers. That was a huge one following 9/11, specifically targeting the Muslim community. You know, there was a program that, you know, was part of the Patriot Act and a number of other surveillance initiatives that were going on at that time that were specifically registering, in this case, males from Middle Eastern countries. And, you know, not only were they explicitly required to go and register every few months their location, who they were living with, you know, what they were doing at that time, but then that information was used to track them via these automated license plate readers that they would install outside mosques and keep track of who was coming and going to these places of worship. And then they would sometimes follow individuals, you know, throughout their day to see who else they were interacting with, where else they were going, what they were doing with their time. And, you know, it was this really egregious violation of privacy and of freedom of religion. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on all my words today. I'm so tired.
You're fine. This happened. I'm chugging a Red Bull.
Sorry. No, it was just this really, really egregious violation. And, you know, the effect of something like that is not only that the civil rights of those specific people who were targeted by a technology and a program like that, that their rights were violated, but then all of the other people who, you know, later found out about this when this news broke and were then terrified to then go to the mosque or to go to their community centers or to go visit their family members because they were worried that they were being tracked. And so, you know, that's something, again, that we'll see with a lot of these technologies, that because of those abuses and fear of future abuses, you know, we're seeing people not attending protests because facial recognition has been used to track BLM protesters and other protesters. You know, we'll see the Muslim community be, you know, definitely on extra guard of using things like prayer apps after data breaches. And, you know, there was a recent one in November that Vice broke that, sorry, I'm having a day, guys. In November, they broke the story that a number of Muslim prayer and dating apps were selling the data of users to the US military,
right,
to ICE, and, you know, a number of third-party, you know, third parties that we don't know who they are or what they're doing with that information. And something like that alone could then deter people from using the products or going to the mosque or, you know, going to protests or whatever was targeted in that case.
It's especially troubling when it's something like you said about a protest or going to the mosque, going to your place of worship. The silencing impact on that is like, that's a ripple effect. It's one thing to say, I don't want to use the Disney Princess Pixar baby face app, like boo-hoo, you know, but when it's things like it affects your First Amendment rights, your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, that's really disturbing, I think, and can have a really chilling ripple effect on the community. It's also, we can talk more about this, but what has been done to the Muslim community, you know, for decades now in the US in terms of surveillance, just, it continues to blow my brain because it's so prevalent, it's so unconstitutional, it's so invasive. And it's just crazy. If this happened, to white people, like, we would be, it just wouldn't happen, you know. People would be freaking out, be talking about it, you know, having people go undercover into a place of worship for no other reason than there's a particular faith worshiping there, and spying on people in their place of worship and collecting data on just everyday Americans. I mean, it's like I said, it just blows my brain. Like, I'm almost speechless that it's still going on. But
that was one of the things that struck me most when I started working for CAIR, is the prevalence of conversations about FBI contacts.
Yeah, all the time.
I mean, you all know this is a conversation we have on a daily basis. Yeah. And, right. You know, as an attorney for CAIR, we get calls on a weekly basis that people have had FBI agents show up to their houses, which, you know, is usually almost even a safer option, because at least you know that they're there and they're going to be questioning you, you know, as opposed to, like you said, Jess, these undercover agents, or, you know, being surveilled from afar. But that is just such a fact of life in the Muslim community. And that is something that even having studied some of these periods in, I don't even want to say history, because, you know, it's an ongoing thing, but, you know, having studied the post 9/11 era, and, you know, talking about these laws and programs like the Patriot Act that I mentioned before, and these registration systems, it did not occur to me just how prevalent this was. And you know, it's wild. It's wild.
Before we move on to the next questions, Brianna, if someone is contacted by the FBI, or if FBI shows up at your door, what should people do?
Fantastic question, Jess. The very first thing that you want to do is invoke your right to remain silent. And one of the things that is so tricky about your right to remain silent is that you can't just stay silent. This goes for police, this goes for FBI. You must say, I am invoking my right to remain silent, and let them know that you would like to speak to them with your attorney. So we do have door cards that you can download from our website, or you can contact us and we can give you, you know, a specific script that you can follow, because we understand that that's a very, very stressful situation, you know, if an agent shows up at your door. But you can let them know that, you know, you have no problem speaking with them, but you would like to do it with your attorney. So, you know, you can either give them CAIR's number and they can contact us, or you can get their card and let them know that we'll be in contact. And then you give us a call, but under no circumstances do you answer any questions. And you do not need to let them into your home or go with them unless they have a warrant.
Talk to CAIR Washington before you talk to the FBI. Call us.
Always, always, always.
Jen, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the facial recognition technology ban that we just passed in King County. What was that about? Why is it a victory? Why is this important?
Sure. Well, face recognition is one form of surveillance technology that is particularly worrying because it enables invisible and persistent government surveillance on just an enormous scale. It enables the tracking of people's movements and their associations without their knowledge or consent, which chills free speech, free association, it undermines press freedom, and it threatens the free exercise of religion. But, you know, we emphasize that face recognition technology fuels racial injustice and inequity, regardless of its inaccuracy rate, because of all the things I just mentioned. But it's also important to realize that face recognition is absolutely inaccurate. And we just, in the past year or so, we learned of at least 3 Black men who were wrongfully arrested and jailed due to a false face recognition match. We know that this technology is disproportionately inaccurate for BIPOC individuals, transgender individuals, non-binary individuals, the children, and the elderly. And we have just emphasized that Black and brown people should not have to pay the price with their lives and well-being to beta test racially biased face recognition systems. But again, we emphasize that even if this technology were perfectly accurate, it would still be used to disproportionately scrutinize marginalized communities. So it would still lead to life or death encounters with law enforcement and should not be allowed in our society. So we have worked with the Tech Equity Coalition, CAIR Washington, and many other local and national partners to push forward a ban on this technology for King County government agencies. We've been working on this for quite a while, and just last week, we got a unanimous vote in favor of this ban in the full King County Council. So we have become the first multi-city county in the country to pass a government ban on face recognition technology. That is absolutely huge.
Yeah,
and
huge.
I also want to share like why this is so astounding, because King County is a headquarters to both big tech companies, Microsoft and Amazon, which are two of the biggest producers of face recognition technology. So I really think this demonstrates just how much people have recognized the dangers of face recognition technology. It also showcases the amazing coalition effort that went, that was so critical to passing this ban. And it really paves the way for us to start having a critical discussion about what are the allowable and unallowable uses of technology in our society, who gets to make these decisions. And it starts to push for the conversation about, the conversation in which we question the assumption that technology is inevitable and that we can't stop it at all.
I want to get into that a little bit later, because that is what always goes through my head. And I think a lot of people's heads like, well, this is just the future. And how are we going to, stop this? I was actually surprised. What's that, Brianna?
Sorry. I was just going to say one thing on that exact point. Yeah. And this goes to the conversation that you and I were having off the show earlier, is Jen always makes the point when she talks about this, that you can't leave home without your face. Like, it's your face. There's nothing you can do about it. So, when Jess and I were discussing previously about, well, I'm just going to decide to opt into that anyways, or, maybe that's a risk I want to take, or maybe this is something that is inevitable. But your face, you can't opt in and out of your face. The only way to truly avoid facial recognition, face surveillance, is if you don't ever leave your home. And that's that's not an option for people.
I just kind of figure my face is everywhere. Or they just, no, that's a really good way to put it. And Jen, you already talked about this, which is what I was going to follow up and ask you, is that, people say, well, it's technology. Like, isn't technology blind? It's neutral, it's just a program. But the reality is, people create programs. People tell algorithms what to look for. Like, we input the data, and because human beings are creating this stuff, and I might not be quite wording this right, but the data that this technology uses is biased. So, a 2019 federal study from the National Institute of Standards and Technology found that Asian and African American faces were misidentified up to 100 times more often in some algorithms conducting one-to-one matching. So, and Jen, you spoke about it so eloquently, but it's just not true. Like, this technology is biased. And yeah,
you're totally right. It is biased because the data is biased, because the concept of the technology itself is biased. I mean, just one example is that it is, it disproportionately misidentifies many types of people: BIPOC individuals, transgender individuals, children, women, etc. But it does not work on non-binary individuals, because the technology presupposes that there are two genders. Therefore, it will not work on non-binary individuals. I mean, there are a load of assumptions that go in the design and development of the technology. And as you said, the data itself is biased because it relies on often data that relies on a history of over-policing of communities of color. But also with surveillance technologies, the communities that are most impacted by these technologies often don't get to decide not just how the technology will be developed, but whether or not it should be developed at all. And that's what we're trying to do with this conversation about moratoria and bans, by putting a stop and saying, let's take at the very minimum, a pause so that we can have a conversation and see whether this technology is compatible with our democracy and the values we want to espouse.
Right. And we can do that. We can do that. Thank you, Jen. Aydin, I want to bring you in. Really quick introduction for people who may be watching who aren't familiar with you or your work. Aydin Anwar is the Community Outreach Fellow at CAIR Washington. So she does outreach for CAIR Washington across Washington State. She's also a human rights activist and Uyghur American who has also done activism around the genocide that is happening in East Turkestan. And Aydin, I would love if you could kind of connect for us this issue of surveillance here in the US or surveillance in Washington State, and how is surveillance technology being misused abroad, and how is it part of this larger result of the war on terror and global Islamophobia?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Jen and Brianna, for all your insight into facial recognition technology here in the States and what that can look like. I do want to kind of point out or bridge back to the idea that this whole technology is inherently biased and it's meant to oppress people. And one of those examples is the way that China is using technology and surveillance to essentially mass incarcerate an entire nation. In this case, it's the nation of East Turkistan, a nation that's currently under the occupation of China. It's also known as Xinjiang, which means new territory in Chinese. So there's a whole colonial aspect to this as well. And so if those who are listening don't really know much about the situation or haven't heard of this nation, I encourage you to look it up and do additional research because it is a lot of context to it. But I myself have over 90 relatives deemed as missing right now, right now in East Turkestan, China has detained millions of people in concentration camps and prisons. And how do they determine if people are sent to these camps and prisons? It's through surveillance and through technology. And what China has done is criminalize very basic acts to basically claim these people are potential terrorists. So China has now made acts of worship a crime, to the point where you can be sentenced to 15 to 25 years of prison for simply being somebody who prays 5 times a day, or somebody who has a name like Muhammad or Fatima, which are very conventional Muslim names. That itself is another reason for you to be sent to these camps and prisons. And by the way, these camps and prisons are aimed, according to the Chinese government, to re-educate the Uyghur mind, claiming that these people are not normal, they have a virus in their brain that needs to be cleansed, that they are potential terrorists. If we don't stop the root of the problem, which is in this case Islam or their ethnicity as an Uyghur Turkic person or any other Turkic person, then there's going to be issues arising. They claim, we're going to go around bombing people and killing innocent people. So we got to get rid of that root. And so in order to determine if you qualify for these camps, they're basically, logging into your smartphone or hacking into your smartphone. You got to go around every time you go outside, you got to carry your phone with you. If you don't carry your phone with you, you are deemed as suspicious. They're like, what do you have to hide? They have facial recognition technology all over the streets. Every few blocks, you see a camera. A camera is surveilling you. They now have technology to now detect your own emotions. So it's considered a crime, or it's you're actually questioned if you show any type of sadness or discontent with the Chinese government, or just in general. They'll be like, why are you sad? This happens both inside the camps and prisons and outside. And now it's to the point where it's beyond just technology itself. They actually have Chinese officials living inside Uyghur homes to monitor their everyday activity, to make sure they're not engaging in religion, to assess their political views. And they even have programs they even have programs by the government that basically encourage families to inform one another, to inform the government about activities of your mom, your sister, your brother, your cousin. And if you don't inform the government about what your own family member did, then again, you're deemed as suspicious and sent to a camp. So right now, I actually have extended family members in these camps. One of my family members was sent to a camp in 2017 because he had went abroad to the United States to attend my cousin's wedding. Again, we don't know where he is now, if he's alive or dead, and you know what his life is going to look like in the next few years. And I want to point out that, I also want to point out that China is now using this technology to also basically gather data of people's DNAs, iris scans. They're forced to go into these health clinics and just get a bunch of, again, biometric data that are very, very intrusive. And basically China claims it to be some kind of public health program, but with no reason whatsoever given. So they have millions of data on the Uyghur people, on other Turkic people that basically would never on a normal basis give to anybody. So I just wanted to kind of give a context background to how honestly deadly this technology can be and how governments are utilizing it.
Thank you, Aydin. I think I'm so sorry about what is being done to your family and to other people in East Turkestan. It's horrifying, and I think it's really good to talk about because it does show people the dangers of this technology and how it can be used. I'm sorry, my laptop is dying. I have to plug it in 1 second. I want you all to see my sweatpants. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Aydin. And I know it's a lot, and you kind of give us like a broad picture and some examples of what is happening over there. I know too, Aydin, you've talked about, you spent some time in Turkey talking with refugees who were fleeing East Turkestan, fleeing the Chinese genocide. And they've told you stories about being watched by the Chinese government. You've also shared with me a couple stories about your family members, how they've experienced being monitored or surveilled by Chinese government officials. Would you mind sharing one or two of those stories with people?
Yeah. So one story that I had mentioned, and I don't really bring it up much, but I realize this is very, very relevant. My cousin would actually talk about, he mentioned this, when he was living there, he remembers putting himself on house arrest for 40 days. So he did not leave the house for 40 days. He said he almost went crazy. And when he asked him why, he was like, it's because he was blacklisted by the Chinese government because his siblings were in the US. So they marked his ID, his identification. So when he go, and so by the way, when people go outside, they have to go through multiple checkpoints, go through multiple cameras. You have to carry your ID on you. So when you go through these checkpoints, they're going to ask who you are. And immediately his system or his ID was linked to being considered dangerous or considered to be, tied to some type of diasporic activity that could be linked to some kind of terrorism. And so he talked about that experience of that being traumatizing and so scary to even step outside the house, to even run a basic errand. So he could not do that. And people in Turkey, with regards to the Uyghur refugees in Turkey, there are people telling me just generally the feeling of being watched constantly, like every action, to the point where they could, I think they would describe it as being suffocating every day, but not actually dying. So, the fear of their, I remember one mother was telling me how she would be so afraid to tell her son to go get milk from outside because she would be afraid that he would never come back, because they would arbitrarily detain young males and put them in these camps in prison with absolutely no reason whatsoever, and using the technologies to kind of claim that these kids or these boys are somewhat dangerous or whatnot. Another example off the top of my head was just being one mother talked about how she educated her kids Islamically. She wanted them to be raised as devout Muslims, and so she wanted them to have some kind of Islamic education, but obviously practicing religion, practicing Islam right now is completely forbidden, and doing so, again, equates you to being a terrorist. So she basically had her kids go into a moving car, and had the teacher was in that car, and they would just kind of drive around the town, the neighborhood, as they're, you know, doing their recitations and, you know, doing their lessons. And that was their way of going to school. Basically, it's, you know, a form of underground schooling where nobody is supposed to know. But yeah, that was how she basically managed to educate her kids on a more religious basis. And to me, that blew my mind, because I was like, you know, I was born and raised here, went to Sunday school, you know, go to attend Islamic lectures, you know, with pride, and, you know, you go excitedly, but these people are scared for their lives, and they're trying to, and now it's to the point where now people don't even want to even embark, or they're too, it's too much of a risk to even attempt these things because of what we're seeing. And by the way, when I spoke to these refugees, this was 2016, before the camps even started. So you can imagine the fear that people are experiencing now, seeing that millions of people in our nation are now actually being incarcerated and experiencing methods of genocide, including forced sterilization, torture, and other horrific occurrences.
Aydin, what do you say to people that look at that and say, well, that would never happen here? That's extreme. You know, this is the US, we have rights. Or people that maybe have a laissez-faire attitude towards things like surveillance technology. Well, I haven't done anything wrong, you know, like, what do you say to people like that?
Well, I'm going to go back to Jen's point earlier about how this technology, again, is not meant, it wasn't created in your favor. It's not meant to uplift you. It's actually meant to do the opposite, which is oppress you. And even if it doesn't seem like that openly in the beginning, there are, you know, you are being targeted, right? So even if you're not necessarily doing anything wrong, the government, whoever is surveilling you, can find something to be like, hey, you did this little action. What does this mean? And then, you know, go from there to question you, and basically kind of criminalize every little thing you do, until you, you know, are essentially forced to confess for something you never did, or to just claim that, you know, you have some kind of dangerous mindset, like the Chinese government uses as an excuse, you know, to lock you up, or to, you know, God forbid, punish your family, or punish you, or just honestly surveil you for the rest of your your remaining time. And a lot of times unknowingly, you wouldn't even know that you're being watched by the government. So again, this technology is not meant for us. It's not, again, it's inherently biased, and it's inherently meant to further oppress a weaker population. I think that would be my response. I don't know if you guys have other thoughts.
No, I asked this question because things that you've said to me in the past about like your frustration sometimes with people in the US being like, everything's fine here, you know, we don't need to, or looking at China like this is an extreme example. It's like, but that stuff, not on the same scale, but that stuff has happened in the US, as you've brought up, as Jen has brought up. The US government, since its inception, has surveilled, you know, Black Americans and infringed on their constitutional rights and spied on them in the Muslim community. So it does happen here. It is happening here. And if you want to live in a democracy and have some rights, I think we should all care about. And that actually leads me to my next question, which is for Jen, you know, and this is probably something you all could talk to, but the Muslim community is perhaps the most surveilled community in the US in terms of like modern surveillance technology, because of course 9/11 has been used to justify putting people, including children, on things like no-fly list, watch list. The FBI, as we know, has for years infiltrated and spied on Muslims in their houses of worship for no other reason than the fact that they're Muslim. Law enforcement has racially and religiously profiled the Muslim community for decades now, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just wondering, Jen, if you can, like, I was thinking, how is this still going on and how is this legal?
I mean, I think, so I think Brianna can also answer part of this question, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the dangers of surveillance and privacy invasions have particularly been salient for the Muslim community because the Muslim community is one of the most surveilled communities in the US. And as Brianna mentioned earlier, with the passage of the Patriot Act weeks after 9/11 and other surveillance programs that were launched shortly thereafter, these sort of programs enabled so many of the surveillance abuses that have directly harmed Muslim communities as well as Arab communities, and anyone who could possibly be conceived as being Muslim, even if they're not. The Patriot Act legitimized invasive, suspicionless, and discriminatory profiling of already over-surveilled communities. And even after a decade after 9/11, as Brianna mentioned, the Muslim community was being illegally targeted by the NYPD, whose officers used powerful ALPR technology to collect photos and license plate numbers of people at mosques and warrantlessly surveilled innocent community members. You know, that wasn't legal. You know, that's not legal. That was struck down as illegal, but that doesn't remedy the harms that were done and continue to be done on the Muslim community because of these awful policies that further entrenched racial and religious profiling. You know, so I think another reason a lot of what should be illegal is continuing is because of the power of new artificial intelligence-based technologies and automated decision-making systems that use proxies for data points and variables that should not be used. So even if you're not specifically, for example, explicitly targeting the Muslim community or a specific member of the BIPOC community, you can use proxies that showcase very clearly different characteristics that may be used for targeting by police departments, by government agencies. So it's that much more important that we have really strong data privacy laws, but also laws that outlaw discrimination via these sort of systems. Because right now it's really hard to hold these systems accountable that continue to discriminate against people, but very secretly and in very unaccountable ways.
Can I add on to that point?
Well, I want to ask for some clarification from the people who aren't experts on this. What do we mean by proxy? Like, what is an example of something being used as a proxy?
That is an excellent question. So by proxy, I mean something that seems relatively innocuous, like a variable that seems relatively innocuous, but actually indicates something else. So for example, you might not think that from just by looking at a zip code or a census block data, you could immediately tell the race of somebody. But in many cases you can. Or you can use a combination of really seemingly innocuous data points, like what shampoo do you buy? What store do you visit? Plus, who's your friend? And then when you put those together, you can create a really intimate profile of somebody's life. And that's what makes it really hard to often pinpoint discrimination and who's doing it, because these algorithms or these computers, right? These formulas that make decisions and tell police where to allocate their resources or what credit score to give someone. They're shrouded in secrecy, right. Often in and because they're shrouded in secrecy, they're unaccountable. And even if they discriminate, it's hard to say who did it. Did the machine did it? Did you do it? Even if the machine did it, how do we hold it accountable? We don't even know what's in the so-called black box. So that's right. Kind of what I mean by proxy.
I see. That's fascinating. Thank you for that explanation. Brianna, I know you had something you want to add.
I was just going to, in response to your question about, it's 2021, how are we still getting away with this? How is this, considered okay? And I was just going to touch on the fact that one of the other ways, besides everything that Jen mentioned, that this is still happening is through the framing of, we want to protect Muslim communities from radicals that might, harm them or give them a bad name. We want to make sure that we know that everyone, generally in the Muslim community is good people, and we support them and we want to protect them. So it's even more important that we root out these radical elements, and that becomes the basis for things like CVE programs, countering violent extremism programs. And that is money coming from the federal government, most of the time,
a lot of money.
The Department of Homeland Security, more than anywhere else. And a lot of times that money is going to nonprofits, it's going to universities, it's going to places within the community that are then supposed to spy on the community. And, one of the things that really struck me during the pandemic and, all schooling going virtual is that, universities could be monitoring students' actions and also being paid to root out, extremism. But when extremism is defined by these completely innocuous, non-data driven characteristics, like how long someone spends on the internet, or how many times a day they pray, or, who they're talking to, things like that, that are just, that are so innocuous, but are now being mapped and collected and then reported. The danger of programs like that just grew exponentially with the pandemic, in my opinion, and that's something that I've been really concerned about. And I think that's something, it became very large during the Obama administration, and it's something that we're starting to see a rise in again, even since the beginning of the Biden administration. Now we're not seeing quite the explicit Islamophobia and rooting out of terrorism that we were hearing in discourse from Trump. But we now have this other framing where, no, we're doing this to help you. And, I think that's something to be aware of, and just to keep in mind as well, because I definitely think that perpetuates it.
Thank you for that, Brianna. Yeah, gosh, so much I feel like we could talk for hours, but we don't have hours. We have 6 minutes left. So I'm going to move us along. But Jen, you alluded to this earlier in the conversation. It's 2021. These technologies have been developed and they've been around for over a decade now, if not decades. And they're used in so many parts of our lives, so many parts of the country, in both public and private sectors. It feels like it's just in the fabric of everything. We also live in, one of the biggest tech cities in the nation, with tech giants like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And this is for both of you, or all of you, what do you say to people that say that it's too late to close Pandora's box at this point? Like, this is just the way of the future, we gotta accept it.
I think that is creating a future. That sort of belief perpetuates a future we probably don't want to see. Our rights here in the US are deeply connected with people's human rights all across the world. Some of the biggest tech companies that create surveillance devices for government agencies around the world, are US-based companies, right? Like Microsoft and Amazon are two of the biggest developers of facial recognition technologies. I think we have to start questioning the assumption and pushing back on the assumption that technology is inevitable. If we want to create a future in which technology is really created by people who have historically been disproportionately surveilled and harmed by technologies, then we can't just accept what tech companies are telling us, which is that technology is great. It'll help all our lives. The benefits are worth more than the costs. It'll make your lives easier. We have to be asking who gets to define the costs and who gets to define what benefits are. And are those who are being harmed being supported in highlighting those harms and bringing those up when we talk about those costs and benefits? I think that one step people can take is when they see, for example, here in Seattle, where I'm based, we have a law called the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance that requires agencies to get approval before they acquire any new surveillance technology. If you have such a law in your jurisdiction, or you have similar sort of regulations that allow for some public scrutiny to happen around technologies, you should be contacting your policymakers to ask them questions about, what are the impacts about these technologies? Have you actually talked with the people who are likely to be most impacted by these surveillance tools? I think just starting to question is really, really important. Otherwise, tech companies and government agencies who have a lot more power and influence within legislatures will be shaping these conversations. So that's why I'm really, really grateful to the work that CAIR Washington does, that other partners within the Tech Equity Coalition do, because that is a work highlighting the history of surveillance, highlighting others' voices. Like, that is the work we do to push back against this assumption. That was really long-winded, but
no, that was great. And I was gonna say, like, and literally, like, I feel like talking about these tech companies, I'm sorry, my baby is screaming in the background. You might hear Ezra screaming, sorry guys. My husband's watching him, I didn't leave him or anything. But we should feel empowered, because you're right, Jen, like, if we don't do anything, automatically they're gonna do what they do. The people with power, the tech companies, government, they're going to do what they want to do. But like, literally, we just had this huge victory in King County with, the second largest tech city after San Francisco, Amazon, Google, all these powerful companies with millions or billions of dollars. And we had a unanimous vote to ban facial recognition technology. That's huge. And that is directly because of the work of the women here today, not me, but you guys, and other, community activists and community groups who've been doing this work day after day. I don't think people see that, but like, there is a coalition of people out there who this is what they do, and they are protecting us and fighting for the rest of us. And I think that we should all be just really encouraged by that. What about some things people can do? Let's talk about like action that people can take here in Washington State that helps protect civil rights or pushes back on some of this tech surveillance. And then Aydin, I want to ask you as well about what people can do either to learn more and educate themselves on the genocide that is happening to the Uyghurs, and or anything that people can do to take action to put pressure on the Chinese government or even our elected officials. So first, Jen and Brianna, do you have any action items that people can take today?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, just generally speaking, one of the best action items people can take is just fighting apathy, fighting that feeling of inevitability, because the more that we chalk this up as something that's just, we live with this, it's inevitable, we have to deal with this, the more that governments can abuse it, and the more that capitalism can co-opt it and abuse it as well. And it's not inevitable. We can fight it. So awareness is the first part. And a very tangible thing that we've been working on with the Tech Equity Coalition over the last year is developing a really robust data privacy law that would apply statewide. And we made a great showing this year, and we did stop what we believed to be a much more harmful corporate-friendly data privacy law this year, which was just a really huge win. Yeah. But we are hoping to gain a lot more ground with the People's Privacy Act going forward next year. And you can talk to your representatives and let them know that you do care. One of the things that we heard in meetings with elected officials was, yeah, I don't care if I get targeted ads. This is not harmful. I don't see what the big deal is. Are people actually upset about this? So what you can do is show them that you do care. Show them that you're not satisfied with this being the status quo. And when we speak up, when we show them that this is an issue that matters to us, then they're going to have to sit up and take action. And I think that's, a huge first step.
Awesome. Thank you, Brianna. Jen, did you have anything to add?
I think Brianna summed it up super well, but I'll point to a few resources that folks can look at. we have developed with the Critical Platform Studies group a toolkit called the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit that provides a list of questions people can start to ask policymakers. Also a flow chart you can kind of look at to understand what is an automated decision system or a surveillance tool. Also, Data for Black Lives recently came out with an excellent report about data capitalism, which I think is just wonderful. So I highly encourage folks to take a look at that. I think Brianna just said it super well, fighting apathy, just staying engaged, just questioning assumptions. But honestly, just tuning into these live chats every week and just staying engaged with community members who have very important things to say is also a big part of the fight.
Thank you, Jen. What was that first toolbox that you mentioned?
It's called the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit. So I'll drop a link in the chat or email folks so you have those resources.
I found it.
Okay, great.
So this is through ACLU-WA. We're going to link it in the comments. Great. I'm going to send this to Katie so Katie can put it in the comments.
You can also follow discourse on Twitter at the hashtag #RealPrivacy4WA. That is the hashtag that we used throughout the legislative session to track the privacy fight. And I imagine that we will continue to use that with the Tech Equity Coalition and other allies that are working on this fight.
Awesome. Thank you. Whew, okay, Aydin, can you talk about what people can do if they want to learn more about what's happening in East Turkestan and if there's any action items that we can take?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep this quick because I know we're over time.
This is our longest episode ever.
But it's a lot to talk about, and a lot to cover. So if you want to learn more about what's happening, there are a lot of online resources out there. I would say just honestly, even Googling it now brings up a lot of reports, articles, testimonies about what is happening, testimonies by former camp survivors and political prisoners, people who have fled the region. There was actually this past week, there was an Uyghur tribunal where people were coming in and giving testimony as to the horrors that they were experiencing. So I encourage everyone to really listen to these stories, because I think there's also generally a lot of genocide deniers out there who claim that a lot of what is being stated is a product of Western propaganda, and that this is just the West's way of trying to bash China, rather than actually listening to the oppressed people themselves and having them talk about their experiences. So I would encourage you to look into that data, to look into the information and really educate yourself. Also read into the history of East Turkestan, because this is something that is also systematically being erased by the Chinese government. You know, they don't make this information available, understanding that this is part of a larger occupation that has taken place most recently since 1949, just like Tibet, for example. A lot of people don't know that, understanding that we are Turkic people with our own distinct ethnicity, culture, language, etc. So I guess the first thing here is education. And if you go to saveuyghur.org, SAVEUIGHUR.org. That website lists a bunch of resources that you can access to, action items. We're actually calling on people to boycott certain companies that are now source from Uyghur forced labor. So a lot of these detainees of these camps are now being turned into modern day slaves. And so there are a lot of American companies, or a lot of global companies that we love to buy from, that are actually sourcing the cotton and a lot of the products from there. To name a few, including Zara, Apple. There were even like some companies that we had called out before. Yeah. Nike, Adidas, H&M formerly, kind of admitted to it, and then they apologized. So there are some companies that actually responded and said that we're not going to do it anymore. But Tommy Hilfiger, Ralph Lauren, Orders, which is like the biggest baby supplying, I feel like the most popular company for baby clothes. 84, and by the way, 84% of China's cotton actually comes from East Turkestan, where they're using that slavery to basically continue doing what they're doing. So just kind of like, there's a lot of resources out there that will kind of go through that, but those are just, some off the top of my head. Also calling your congressperson to support the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and because that has not been formally signed by the president. Essentially, that is going to prevent forced labor goods from entering the United States. So that's a huge step forward in terms of local advocacy that you can do. And also just educating people in your community, and also amplifying the fact that this is a genocide. This is nothing less, and it's happening very, very swiftly. And if we don't take action now, including with what Jen and Brianna mentioned regarding facial technology, we may see a whole nation wiped out very, very soon. And we're already starting to see that. Unfortunately, a lot of it has taken place, but it all comes down to individual action at the end of the day too.
Thank you, Aydin. Was it saveuyghur.org?
Yeah, I can type that in.
Okay, thanks. We'll put that in the comments too. I think I've been there. It's a great hub for from there you can kind of branch out. Thank you everyone so much for being part of this conversation today. I know this is our longest episode, but it was a really big topic. We could probably talk for hours about all of this. So I really appreciate your time, your expertise, your individual passions, and the work that you're all doing around these separate but interconnected issues. And we're actually, next week, we're not going to have our path forward because one of our team members, we're doing a baby shower for her. So we're prioritizing the baby shower. But the following week, we will have an episode, and the July 1st episode, I'm really excited. We're going to have Marcus Green, the founder of South Seattle Emerald, former Seattle Times journalist. He's going to be joining us to talk about community journalism, the shifting landscape of media, and also what his own path into journalism, which was a bit non-traditional. So very excited for that. Thank you all again so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Jen.
Great talking with you.
Yeah.